Hello, good morning, and welcome to the next BIOL3465 Tropical Forest Ecology and Use lecture. This lecture is Biotic Characteristics of Tropical Rainforests, Structure and Physiognomy. So in this lecture we will be looking at trees in tropical rainforests, because trees are the main structural component of a tropical rainforest. When you walk into a tropical rainforest, what do you see? Trees, loads of trees. And we're going to take a look at how those trees modify the microclimates of these tropical rainforests. So we're going to take a look at how these biotic characteristics of trees modify the micro-abiotic characteristics. And that's a bit of a lead in to other vegetation in tropical rainforests. So trees are the main components of tropical rainforests, but there are other vegetation components of tropical rainforests who are also important. I want to describe the main biotic and abiotic features of tropical rainforests so that we can see the changes which occur, and also the scene or the scenario set for the different biotic interactions in tropical rainforests. For instance, competition between different plant species and different plant individuals. So let's get into it. Trees in tropical rainforests. As I said before, when you walk into a tropical rainforest, the first thing you see are trees. Trees really define a tropical rainforest. So a tropical rainforest is really a set of trees all growing very close together. Now they can grow very close together, and they can grow quite tall because the primary productivity in a tropical rainforest is very high. So because there's high primary productivity, in other words there's a lot of photosynthesis and a lot of fixing of carbon, that means that very large biomasses can be maintained in a tropical rainforest. Okay? Or can be built and then maintained in a tropical rainforest. So that means that very large structures, very tall structures can be maintained, and the root systems underneath the ground can be maintained as well. And those root systems are required to bring enough water up to the surface so that the photosynthesis can occur. So when you look at a tropical rainforest, you can see the main elements are the trees. See, you've got the two big trees there. And you would also have understory elements, or trees which don't get so tall but sort of fill in the gaps between the main trees. And then you would get understory trees. So these are understory palms. This looks like an understory tree. Some of these understory trees will never grow up into the canopy, but some of these understory trees are probably seedlings or saplings of trees which eventually will grow up into the canopy. Okay? And you will also get vegetation which occurs much closer to the ground surface. Some of this vegetation will be tree seedlings which will grow further, and some of that vegetation will be ground flora which are always going to remain close to the ground. The end result is a whole set of vegetation cramming into every niche. So dominated by these tall trees, but also at other layers in the canopy you have your sub-canopy trees and your seedlings and so on. And so there are many different layers and heights. It's all very chaotic. In a temperate deciduous forest, broadleaf deciduous forest like you would find in, say, Western Europe, there tends to be a very defined structure to the canopy. Okay, because there tends to be a single species in the forest, most of the trees are of a similar height. In a tropical rainforest, because there's a whole set of different species, then the trees tend to grow to different heights. In a temperate forest, the understory trees are all pretty much of the same species, so they all also tend to grow to a similar height. And in a tropical rainforest, because there's lots of different species of understory plants, they all grow to different heights. So the end result is a very chaotic and unstructured canopy, many different heights, and that really does aid in niche packing and supporting many different species. So trees dominate the biomass, dominate the structure, dominate everything in a tropical rainforest. Actually, not quite everything, but trees are the main feature of a tropical rainforest. And it's almost inevitable that trees should be the dominant feature in a tropical rainforest, because they are the ultimate expression of primary productivity. So if you have enough primary productivity, and it continues all the time, then there will be competition between the individuals in that ecosystem. The competition will be for light. If water and nutrients are not limiting, then the competition will be for light. And the best way to compete for light is to grow tall. And that is exactly what happens in a tropical rainforest. And those tall plants we see as trees. Now, the numbers of individuals and the biomass at each level in the canopy is dominated by trees. So obviously up at the top canopy, the only plants that are going to reach up the top there are trees, so they dominate the top of the canopy. But trees also dominate the middle of the canopy, where the vast majority of individuals and biomass are saplings of trees, trees which will grow up into the canopy as long as they survive. And at the ground level, the plants which dominate in terms of species and numbers of individuals are seedlings of trees. So trees really dominate at all levels in the rainforest, both in terms of numbers of individuals and also by the amount of biomass which is incorporated by each. I put this slide in here. This is from some research we were doing down in the Victoria Miaro Reserve. The top couple of pictures are in a natural tropical rainforest, and the bottom couple of pictures are in a plot which was immediately adjacent to that, the first plot, but in a teak plantation. So each of these dots is a tropical tree, and the larger the dot, the bigger the tree, the greater the diameter at breast height for the tree. Same with the teak plantation. Right, so big trees dominate the plot, but unlike in a teak plantation where the trees are quite regularly spaced and they've been planted that way. I mean, you've had deaths and so on, so the pattern isn't really obvious, but these teak trees are pretty much of an even age, about the same size and quite evenly spaced. But in a natural forest, the distribution of the tree individuals is very haphazard. So there is a lot of randomness in the distribution of the tree species. You would get big trees and you would get small trees. So a natural rainforest will have trees of many different sizes, and those trees will be scattered randomly throughout the forest. Okay? If we look at this picture here, this is a 180-degree hemispherical or fisheye photograph taken from the forest floor looking up. And I'm showing this because you can see the dominance of the trees, but also how the trees compete for the light, and they compete so efficiently that there is practically no open sky and therefore no light, direct light available to the plants in the understory. So the trees have gotten up into the canopy and they've taken all the light, or pretty much all the direct light. So the only light which is left is small sunflecks, as they call them, and we'll talk more about sunflecks later. And that's the only direct light that is, and those sunflecks are very much attenuated. All the rest of the forest floor is basically covered in shade. Everything is shaded, and that has a very big impact on the environment in which plants can grow in the understory. In this teak plantation there are larger gaps in different areas as some trees are lost, and you can pretty much see that all these trees are pretty much an even age, as you can see around there, but here you have some large trees, some small trees, and so on. Okay, now this diagram shows a size distribution, okay, the different sizes of the trees in a tropical rainforest. This particular diagram compares two types of tropical rainforests, white sand forests and terra firma forests. White sand forests are lower nutrient forests, and terra firma forests are higher nutrient forests. This is in the Amazon basin. I'm not really too concerned with the difference between white sand forest and terra firma forest. What I'm more concerned is to show you is the broad distribution of the sizes of the individuals of the trees that you get in a tropical rainforest. As you can see, there is a distribution, and this is a fairly common distribution. You can go and measure the trees in a forest and you will find this same general distribution, where you will have high numbers of individuals of trees in the smaller size class categories, okay, decreasing until you get low numbers of the large trees, okay, in the low numbers of individuals in the large tree size classes. Okay, and you can see that same thing in our representation of our plot here. It's a 1 hectare plot. Okay, you would get many small individuals and a fewer large individuals. Okay, and this size class distribution, we call this a DBH size class distribution, results because the larger trees basically demand more resources. So larger trees need more light, larger trees need more water and nutrients. So only a few large trees can be accommodated in any area. Smaller trees, on the other hand, need less light because they are physically smaller, and less nutrients and less water. So you can pack more smaller trees in. Okay, and this is fortunate because when a big tree dies, we need these smaller trees available to take over the bigger trees. Okay, all of these small trees are not going to survive to the big tree size. Okay, the majority of these small trees are likely to perish before they reach that size. Okay, but you need this large number, because as time goes on, some of these smaller trees are going to die because of too much competition, or they'll be hit by a falling branch or a falling tree. One of these larger trees dies and falls over and knocks over these smaller trees, and so on. Okay? So you'll find this distribution of size classes is very characteristic of a tropical forest. You would find a few large trees, and the gaps in between are filled with these many smaller trees. Okay? The trees in tropical rainforests, when you look at them, are not like the trees that you're going to get, say, growing on campus in the open. Instead, they tend to be very tall to get their leaves up into the canopy. The branches tend to be concentrated at the top of the tree, and the lower part of the trunk of the tree is bare of branches and quite tall and slender. So if this shape of tree was growing on the university campus out in the open, it probably wouldn't last long. The wind would come, catch it, and blow it over. And the only reason why it can survive in this long, slender shape, very top-heavy shape, is because it is supported by the trees around it. It's protected from the wind, okay, around it. So this very tall, slender tree can persist and survive, okay, and so it can concentrate its photosynthetic area up in the top part of the canopy, and it doesn't need to waste leaves down in the understory where the light is much lower. Okay, and this inherently top-heavy design is practical. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about how this shape of tree is known as a sympodal shape. Okay, and it's designed to maximize the amount of light which can be caught up in the canopy. Right, leaves. Leaves of the trees in tropical rainforest change as you move from the ground level up into the canopy. Basically, the leaf size tends to get smaller, and the leaves tend to get thicker as you go upwards in the canopy. So at the bottom of the canopy, you will tend to find trees with very large leaves. The seedlings would have very large leaves. And in fact, some trees would actually have very different sized leaves in the understory compared to up in the canopy. So in the understory they would have large leaves, and on the same tree up in the canopy, if a branch has leaves up in the canopy, the leaves will be much smaller. The reason for this is mainly physiological. As the leaves grow, the amount of water in the leaves really determines how much they grow. If there is a lot of water in the leaves, okay, and there's a lot of water pressure, and the plant is able to pump a lot of water into the leaves, just like blowing up a balloon, the leaves will grow bigger. The cell walls will be thinner, and the leaves will be thinner, and they will be larger. And this benefits the plant because you need a larger surface area, and your chlorophyll and your cells spread out over a wider area so that they don't shade one another. So the cells and the chlorophyll molecules don't shade one another. So they're all arrayed out to whatever light filters through from the canopy. Okay? Up in the canopy, light is not an issue. There is constant high light up in that canopy. The light is up at around 2,000 molecules, microliters of photoactive radiation, or PAR. It's very high. So leaves don't have to be very broad to capture enough light to photosynthesize, and also shading of chlorophyll and cells is not a problem in this very high, strong light, because enough light goes through the first layers of cells to get to deeper layers, so the cells can be much thicker. Okay, thicker, smaller leaves develop up at the top here because there is less water up in the top of the canopy, and the tree is very efficient in pumping water up through its trunk into the canopy. But even so, at quite a few parts of the day, from about mid-morning to about mid-afternoon or late afternoon, there will be a water deficit in those leaves. So those leaves are not going to get as big. The balloon is going to be smaller. The cell walls are going to be bigger and thicker because they're not spread over a wider area. So the leaves are going to be smaller and thicker, okay, up in the canopy. And this isn't so much of a problem because, as I said, you've got strong enough light that it can penetrate through several layers of cells and still have enough photosynthetically active radiation to cause photosynthesis. Okay? Another reason thought to be, or another benefit from having small, thick leaves up in the canopy, is that there is a lot of wind up in the top of the canopy. So these leaves are going to be blown around and bashed against each other by the wind constantly. Well, not constantly, but whenever there is wind blowing across the canopy. Small, thick leaves can survive this physical buffeting much better than large, broad, thin leaves. If you had large, broad, thin leaves up in the top of the canopy and they were buffeted by wind all the time, then they would rapidly tear and rip and become damaged. Okay? Trees, it's thought that compound leaves, or leaves which have a single stalk and the leaf lamina is broken up into many different leaflets, it's thought that this style of leaf has evolved to allow a larger leaf surface area but with less risk of damage. So a compound leaf like this, or like this, is better able to cope with the physical buffering from the wind, okay, without tearing. In effect, it comes pre-torn. Okay, so it's a fairly large surface area for each leaf. Okay, but because each leaflet is already divided, they are relatively strong and can survive that buffeting without ripping and tearing. So maybe compound leaves are designed to offer a large leaf surface area like you would get and capture more light, but are able to survive that physical buffeting. Another feature of leaves, particularly in the understory, are drip tips. These are these little tips at the end here. The logical thought behind drip tips is that they form like a sump to drain the surface of the leaf. So you would have water falling on the surface of the leaves and remaining on the surface of the leaves. And this is a problem for the leaf, because if there is water on the leaves, then light is blocked, and also the light is blocked, and also the stomata will not open, and you cannot get CO2 into the leaves. Okay, so it is in the best interest of the leaves to drain that water from the leaf as soon as possible. And it's thought that a drip tip allows this to happen more efficiently, because drops of water will roll down, and instead of hanging on a broad tip, they are directed down to a very narrow tip where there's much less adhesion between the water and the leaf, and they will just drop off. Okay? So that's the theory of drip tips. But experiments have been done to see whether these drip tips actually do reduce the amount of water on the lamina of the leaf, and therefore do allow greater primary productivity. So leaves like this, one drip tip would have been excised and one would have been left, and the two leaves would have been measured for their productivity and longevity. And no effect was found when those sorts of manipulative experiments were done. So it could be that drip tips really simply do not have any function, and they are really just a representation of extra growth near the midrib of the leaf, where there's more water pumped into the leaves. Okay, so there just happens to be more growth at the end because of greater amounts of water coming through on the midrib. Okay, so that's one theory why you have drip tips. And indeed you do tend to only get drip tips in the understory. In the upper canopy, drip tips are almost always completely absent on a leaf up in the canopy. So drip tips, are they there for drying out, or are they there just as an artifact of growth? Right, shapes of leaves in tropical forests. The shape of a leaf in a tropical forest is generally similar. You would have different types of leaves. You would have simple leaves, you would have compound leaves. The shape of a leaf, a simple leaf, is very similar to the shape of a compound leaflet. Okay, so it's a broadly elliptical shape, okay, with minor variations. So this shape of leaf is obviously the most efficient in carrying out photosynthesis in the tropical rainforest environment, and it seems to be replicated amongst many different trees. So when you walk into a tropical rainforest and you look at the leaves on the ground, they all tend to be quite similar. Okay, and that makes identification of trees pretty difficult. Another feature in trees in tropical rainforests is buttressing. Buttressing are these big flanges of timber which come from the base, flare out at the base of a tree. Okay, to the human eye, especially to the Western human eye, this flaring out of these buttresses looks very much the result of the tree trying to stabilize this very top-heavy structure by broadening the base with buttressing. And this was a generally accepted paradigm for a while, but now people don't tend to associate, scientists don't tend to associate buttressing with structural support, although indeed there probably is an element of it. Scientists instead think that buttressing is more associated with aeration of the roots. So the theory goes that if you have a very large surface area around the base of your trunk, you're going to maximize the amount of oxygen and air which can diffuse into the trunk just before it plunges below ground. Okay, so an aerated vascular tissue inside the trunk going down into the roots means that the roots take with them the maximum amount of oxygen that they can. Okay? And that means the roots can respire more efficiently and grow and do their job more efficiently in a subsurface. So, in support of this, you would tend to find buttressing only in areas where the soil does have a tendency to get wet and less well drained. You would tend to find fewer buttresses in areas where the soil is better drained. Okay? So it could be that buttressing is also a mechanism for aerating the roots. This particular tree is called a pterocarpus tree, photographed in the arena forest where you've been and you will go in the future. And this pterocarpus tree, and pterocarpus trees in general, or swamp bloodwoods, tend to grow in very moist and poorly drained habitats, and the large buttresses are very characteristic of pterocarpus trees. This particular pterocarpus tree also has flanges of the roots, broad planks of the roots coming up above ground again out here, some distance from the trunk. Now obviously these roots are going to offer no structural support, and their function is pretty much obviously as pneumatophores in this fairly flooded environment. It's right by a small stream in the forest. Okay, so this pterocarpus enjoys water year round, doesn't get a drought basically, because there's always water in this stream. But the price it has to pay is the roots may be inundated with water. They may drown. So what it does is it aerates its roots using the pneumatophore roots and using the buttresses. And that is why, one of the reasons why it's thought that buttresses are useful in tropical forests. The structural support side of things, probably there is an element of structural support, but when it comes down to it, this very tall, narrow, top-heavy structure is never going to be supported even by a base which is increased double by these buttressing. Okay, so it's more likely buttresses are pneumatophoric, have a pneumatophoric purpose. Okay, I just want to say a word about identification of trees in tropical forests. You've all experienced that with the first lab, putting things into morphotypes. So you've all got a bit of a sense of how difficult it is to identify trees in a tropical rainforest. And believe me, I talk from experience, it is very difficult to identify trees in a tropical rainforest. The easy trees are the ones which have a very distinctive bark. You can identify the tree just by looking at the tree trunk, and there's patterns of lenticels, smoothness of bark, roughness of bark, the way the bark flakes. They can be used to identify different species. Okay? But the vast majority of trees in tropical rainforests tend to have this generic, smooth, grey, lichen-covered bark, which is very difficult to distinguish one species from another. So you have to resort to some other means, and the leaves are more variable, so you can look at the leaves. But because these leaves tend to be very similar in shape, so for instance this species here, which I think is a Cymbopetalum, and this one is a Tabernae montana, if it didn't have the fruits on it, you would not be able to tell one from the other. Okay? Particularly if you're looking at those leaves at about 20 to 30 meters up in the canopy. Using binoculars helps a lot, but it can be very difficult. So identification of tropical trees in tropical rainforests is very difficult. The leaves are a long way up there, the bark often looks very much the same, but you can usually get about 80% of the trees to 90% of the trees, and that last 10% of the trees, and I talk from experience here, will take about 90% of the time for you to identify. So when I was doing rainforest inventory in the Matura area, we were setting out 25 meter by 25 meter plots and recording all the tree species in those plots. Is it 25 meters? No, it's 50 meters by 50 meters, and we could rapidly measure the position and the size and the dBH of all the trees in a 50 by 50 meter plot. We could do that in a morning and half the afternoon, and then we would spend the next 2 days identifying all the trees, and those 2 days would be taken up. We would spend about an hour on a single tree, which may be very tall and it's difficult to see the leaves and obtain the leaves and so on. So identification of trees in tropical rainforests can be very difficult. So what you say is that's just of academic interest, but it's not. When you are trying to manage your tropical forests, say, you need to pick the trees, you need to be able to identify the trees so you can take out the right timber tree. It's no use just chopping down every tree until you find the right one. You've got to be able to identify it. So identification of trees is important, but it is still difficult. Okay, I want to talk about finally I want to talk about the shape of trees in tropical rainforests. As I mentioned before, trees will tend to change their shape as they go through their life cycle. Trees will tend to be more cylindrical, okay, in shape when they're in the understory. And this is because the light in the understory does not mainly come from above. It actually comes from all directions, because a lot of the light that you get in the rainforest is reflected from leaves, reflected from trunks of trees, before it gets into the understory. So trees in the understory really have a cylindrical or monopodial type of shape. And that shape is the most efficient at collecting light in this understory, where light doesn't come from any one direction. As soon as you get up into the canopy, however, the light tends to come from one direction, and that's from the top, from above. So the tree in response will spread out its crown to catch that maximum amount of light. Okay? So this illustrates it quite well here. All the leaves are concentrated up in the canopy, on the top of the tree, and the branches spread out to spread those leaves over as wide a area of a single plane as possible to maximize the uptake of light. Okay? And this growth form is known as sympodal. Okay? So trees' shapes go from monopodal to sympodal. Now, some trees are known as emergents. Emergents grow above the canopy. I don't think this is an emergent tree, but this would have the shape of an emergent tree, and the canopy would come up to about here. I think this tree has been isolated from the other trees being felled around it. So an emergent tree would grow up above the canopy of all the other trees, stick its head above the canopy, form this sympodal pattern, and be able to enjoy uninterrupted light. Okay? So this emergent characteristic is a very efficient way of, and very competitive way of catching the maximum amount of light. However, it is quite risky because raising your head above the canopy, if you're a tree, exposes you to much more wind and the risk of being blown over by a strong gust of wind. So these emergents, they can maximize the productivity by capturing the most light, okay? But they also don't live as long because eventually they are blown over by a gust of wind. Okay, the wind can catch underneath their canopy. They're not protected by the other trees in the canopy. The wind can get underneath the canopy and blow this tree over. Okay, so in the rainforest you would have the trees growing up into the canopy, and certain brave individuals will go one step further and try and get above the canopy, and they are the emergent trees, but they are more at risk of being thrown over by the wind. Okay, so hopefully you've got a good impression of what a tropical rainforest looks like, how all those trees are all crowded in together, how they're quite tall and slender, how all the branches are concentrated on the top, how the trees change in shape and leaf size and shape as they grow taller. Now I want to talk a little bit about the microclimate which forms underneath all of these trees. Okay, so when you've got all these trees all packed in together, you get a particular type of environment underneath that canopy. It's a unique type of environment, an environment which has been modified by all of these trees packed in together. And it's a microenvironment that you experience when you go into the rainforest, but it is also a microclimate which the seedlings and the offspring of these adult trees needs to survive before they can get up into the canopy. Okay? So here we have a cross-section of a tropical rainforest. This is down south near Guayaguayari, where there's an oil pipeline driven through the forest, and so it exposes a profile of the forest. This is an emergence sticking up above the general canopy, but you can see it's very dark and dense, and there's not very much light in there. Okay, and light is the main thing which varies in the microclimates of a tropical forest. Okay, light levels in the tropics are the highest that they are anywhere around the world, as we've talked about already. So light levels are something like 2,500 molecules per square meter of a photosynthetically active radiation. Okay, and it's about 2,500, yeah. And that's the highest that you get. You get much lower levels in the temperate regions. However, at the bottom of the canopy, that level of light is attenuated to about 0.1% of the light which is incident on the top of the canopy. So as you move down through the canopy, the amount of light that you get decreases, okay, until the forest floor it's all very shaded. Okay, the majority of the light, the vast majority of the light, 99.9% of the light has been removed. Okay, and that's particularly the photosynthetically active wavelengths of the light. Okay, has been filtered out by all these layers of leaves. Okay, so it's estimated that a rainforest would have a leaf area index up in the 20s. Now, leaf area index is a theoretical value which denotes the number of layers of leaves above a area of ground, okay, in a vegetation plot. In a tropical rainforest, it's estimated on average there are about 20 layers of leaves all piled up above any area of ground. Okay? Say in a savanna, that leaf area index will probably be about 1. Okay, if there is a continuous grass canopy, or it may actually be under 1 if there are gaps. Okay, but in a tropical rainforest, it's very high. The leaf area index is very high. Okay, and because of that, light levels are very low in that understory. As I said, 0.1% of the top of the canopy. So just think, all of these plants in this understory have to survive with 0.1% of the light which is incident on top. Now thankfully that light is reliable, it's always there. Okay, there's no winter and there's no summer, there's no increase in light and decrease in light. It's constant, that sort of shaded light, year in, year out. So these plants at the bottom here can specialize and develop adaptations which allow them to survive in this microclimate. Okay? With light decreasing, temperature also shows a declining value from the top of the canopy to the forest floor. So at the top of the canopy, all this light energy heats things up a lot. Okay? But as you move further down in the canopy, the light levels fall, and therefore you get lower temperatures. Humidity responds to this as well. As the temperature falls, the humidity will increase. There's less energy to turn water into vapor, and so you get much more condensing moisture as you go lower in the canopy and the temperature lowers. You couple that with the amount of transpiration which is occurring in the from the vegetation, so there's a lot of evaporation which humidifies the air. And also because of that closed canopy, the air movement is much, much lower below the canopy compared to above the canopy. So in the end, what you get in the microclimate below the canopy in a tropical forest is a very shaded, very dark microclimate. The humidity is very low. The humidity is very very high below the canopy. So let me change that. That's wrong. Humidity is much higher below the canopy surface. Okay, much, much higher. So in fact, near the forest floor, humidity may not vary very much, from around 80 to 90, and at night the humidity goes up inevitably to over 100%. It goes up to 100% every night. So humidity is very high beneath the canopy. And because of the closed canopy nature and the many layers, it's like having a blanket above the Earth's surface, so you don't get any air movement below that blanket of the canopy. So air movement is very low, which preserves that humidity, okay, in that understory of the tropical rainforest. So you get low light, modified lower temperatures, very high humidity, and very low air movement beneath the intact canopy. Now I want to talk a little bit about breaks in the canopy, or gaps in that canopy. These trees don't last forever, they don't live forever. Eventually a tree will die, and often those trees, when they die, they fall over, and quite often when they fall over, they create a hole in the canopy. That hole may be larger than the individual crown of the tree, because it may bring down other trees with it, and so making a fairly large gap. Now these openings in the canopy really radically change the microenvironment. The light increases, temperature increases, humidity decreases, soil moisture will increase, and soil nutrients increase. Now the soil properties change as roots are no longer competing for nutrients and moisture, and so temporarily at least the soil moisture and the soil nutrients will increase. Okay, so that increase in light and that increase in soil moisture and nutrients means that for a short period of time where there is a gap in a rainforest, there is extra resources. Okay, so in where the canopy is intact, okay, there is the resources for growth in terms of light, moisture in the soil and nutrients in the soil have all been taken up and monopolized by the vegetation. Okay, when there's a gap, those resources are released. Okay, so there's a very different microclimate for a short period of time, okay, before that canopy closes over. Okay, and there is a type of guild of plants which have evolved to take advantage of these abundance of resources. Okay, and these are the R-selected pioneer species, and we'll talk more about those in other lectures. But what I want to talk about finally in this lecture is some of the other vegetation in tropical rainforests, so the non-tree vegetation. Now these types of species have evolved to take advantage of that very stable, high humidity, lower temperature, but also very low light microclimate below the canopy of the rainforest. And these plants specialize in these stable microclimates. Because they cannot hope to compete for the light and the nutrients that the trees have, they are much smaller than the trees. They have much lower primary productivity. But because the microclimates are very stable, they are able to take advantage of what resources there are in these reduced niches. So you get plants like this Kunjavoy. You can get this type of species in Trinidad growing in small gaps and in the understory. They have these huge leaves. This leaf would be about 3/4 of a meter across, also known as elephant ear trees. And these plants have evolved these huge leaves to capture the small amounts of light which they can be found in these understory situations. The understory situation is high humidity, which allows this plant to photosynthesize, keep its stomata open, even though that this is a very large surface over which to lose moisture. When it's a high humidity environment, evaporation from these leaves is minimized, okay, because there's simply a very low gradient of moisture between the leaves and the atmosphere, so they don't dry out very quickly. So stomata can remain open and CO2 gathered and light gathered for photosynthesis very efficiently with this very large leaf surface area. Also, this very large leaf surface area can survive in the understory because there's no wind and it's not bashed around, and you can imagine it wouldn't take much wind for this surface area to be extensively damaged and torn and ripped and so on. Okay, so plant species, this growing large broad leaves is a fairly common characteristic of understory, specialist understory plants which grow on the ground. Other types of vegetation are plants which grow on other plants, the epiphytes. There are many hundreds of species of epiphytes in tropical forests. And the only reason that they can survive there is because of the high humidity and the stable environment, which allows them again to photosynthesize for long periods and take advantage of the lower light levels. If there was a less humid environment, these epiphytes would not be able to survive because they would desiccate, because they don't have access to much water perched on the branch of a tree. So you simply don't get epiphytes in drier climates. As soon as you move into a drier climate, epiphytes will disappear. Okay? Similarly, bryophytes growing on the trunks of trees, these are mosses and so on growing on the branches and the trunks of trees, they also are in what is effectively a fairly dry environment, and they only survive because of the high humidity in the atmosphere. This tree here is a Chiconia tree, and I've taken a picture of this. I should put a picture of this because it is an understory tree. Okay, it can survive in the understory, in the low light levels. Okay, and there are many species which specialize in being an understory tree, like the Cooper hoop or the mountain rose. Okay, that will never get up into the canopy, but it is adapted to utilize those very low light levels and survive in the understory. And another life form which you find in a tropical rainforest are plants which don't devote much energy to building their own trunks or biomass, and instead they will climb up on the trunks of other individual trees. And these are the vines and the lianas. And this is actually a very successful life strategy in these tropical forests. You would get plants which are able to germinate on the forest floor and grow up the trunk of a tree and eventually send down roots and be able to survive. Okay? And you would get other species which germinate in the branches of the trees and send down roots and are able to survive. But that period where they must grow up either from the bottom or grow down from the top is very critical, and the high humidity environment in the understory allows those plants to survive. Okay? So biodiversity in tropical rainforests is very high. The tree biodiversity is exceptionally high. You would tend to find many different species in a tropical rainforest. So if you find one tree, as the old quote goes, if you find one tree, you may have to examine and walk many hundreds of meters before you find a species, the individual of the same species. And there are many different reasons that we're going to look at in later lectures put forward to explain this. Okay? One reason is diverse structure and many different niches, allowing many different species to specialize in those different niches. Okay? This may not apply so much to trees, but it is certainly very important when it comes to the non-tree vegetation. They're small enough and they can inhabit many different niches. Just a word on biodiversity to finish. The prize for biodiversity in a tropical rainforest is not actually taken by the primary producers. The primary producers, or the plants, may dominate the forest in terms of biomass, but it's actually an animal species or an animal taxa which dominates the diversity of these tropical rainforests, and those are the insects. There are far more species of insects in a tropical rainforest than there are species of plants. Every tree would have 3 or 4 species of insects which specialize in its own species. So one species of tree may have 3 or 4 insect species which specialize only on that species of tree. So if you look at the diversity of trees in a rainforest, you must multiply that by 3 or 4 to get the number of species of insects in a tropical rainforest. So plants, trees dominate the tropical rainforest, at least by biomass, but it's the animals which have been able to diversify enough to take advantage of that biomass. Okay. See you next time. Bye-bye.